This quiet railway platform is where a remarkable journey came to an end. It's situated about 300 miles south of Moscow at a station that always used to be known as Ostapovo. That was until an elderly writer, feeling unwell, stepped off the train here. 1 week later, by the time the writer died in the station master's house, this remote corner of Russia had become the scene for an extraordinary vigil, attended by the world's press and vast crowds of admirers.
Across the country, mass demonstrations broke out, strikes, and even talk of revolution. Who was this writer who could provoke so much passion, so much trouble?
Shortly afterwards, the station and the village were renamed Lev Tolstoy.
This is Tolstoy in 1908, 2 years before his death, being mobbed by adoring crowds on his way to the train station in Moscow. Tolstoy was by far the most famous Russian of the late 19th century, a towering, Moses-like figure whose immense popularity came firstly from his great novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina.
Tolstoy is, well, in the world of literature, he's God.
But Tolstoy was also one of the most challenging thinkers and moralists of his age, and a fierce critic of the way the country was run.
He was a professional troublemaker. Tolstoy was the man who troubled Russia. He troubled the conscience of the emperors, and he troubled the conscience of the ruling class.
100 years on the centenary of Tolstoy's death last year, an event celebrated around the world, the Russian state seemed to deliberately ignore a writer still seen as uncomfortably anti-establishment. So what is it that makes Lev Tolstoy such an awkward hero? I've come to Russia to try and find out. Sitting in a carriage like this, heading through the Russian countryside, it's not hard to imagine you're in a Tolstoy story. Railways run through so many pages of his fiction. Poignant departures, unexpected meetings, bleak tragedy, and as the setting for the telling of rich, complex, but ultimately profoundly moral stories.
The sun had been beating down all day on the large but crowded third-class carriage. And the heat inside was so stifling that Nekhludoff stayed out on the brake platform. And of all the impressions of that day, the one that arose in his imagination with extraordinary vividness was the beautiful face of the second dead prisoner, with its smiling lips, serious-looking forehead, and the firm little ear below the blue-shaven skull. And the ghastly thing is that a killing has occurred, and nobody knows who did it. But it was a killing.
Who is the killer? Why go to war? What is marriage for? What is life for? Tolstoy was a writer constantly asking his readers and himself difficult questions.
In
the end, his thoughts were not those of a famous writer, but Lev Tolstoy the man. A man who was never satisfied with himself. He was dissatisfied for the whole of his life, and he always wanted to be better, better, and better.
The Tolstoy family estate is 120 miles south of Moscow, and Tolstoy would have made this journey home many times. Family meant everything to him.
Как в нашей сотне, там мои хорошие черня.
Tolstoy came from a large family, and he produced a large family. 100 years on from his death, his great-grandchildren and his great-great-grandchildren have come from all over the world to the ancestral Tolstoy estate of Yasnaya Polyana, where they're welcomed at the gates with the traditional Russian greeting of bread and salt.
In the morning, the play of light and shadow from the big birches along the avenue is just as it was 60 years ago, when I noticed this beauty for the first time and fell in love with it.
Tolstoy's love for Yasnaya Polyana, the lake where he swam, the orchards that he planted, the people who worked on his land, has preserved this Russian idyll almost exactly as it was in his day. This place, and the house in particular, not only retains so much detail of Tolstoy's life, it brings into focus so many fragments of his fiction.
Mama was sitting in the parlour pouring out tea. In one hand she held the teapot, and with the other the tap of the samovar, from which the water poured over the top of the teapot onto the tray. But though she was staring intently at it, she did not realise either this or that we had come in. So many memories of the past arise when one tries to recall the features of someone we love, that one recalls those features dimly through the memories, as though through tears. They are the tears of imagination.
Tolstoy should have had an idyllic childhood, but instead it was scarred by family tragedy.
He was very young when his mother died, 2 years old. That must have had an enormous impact on him subsequently.
Certainly, he was too young to retain any memories of her, but spiritual image, only spiritual image, which influenced Tolstoy throughout his long life.
To lose your mother, never to know her, not to be able to envisage her face, that must be a tremendous loss for anyone. But then to lose your father subsequently when he was only 9 years old, he must have been bereft, really. He must have had a strong personality to be able to deal with that.
Yeah, certainly Tolstoy, as well as his brothers and sister, on the one hand, he was unhappy. He was unhappy, he lost his parents, but on the other hand, Tolstoy had his beloved Yasnaya Polyana. In a way, Yasnaya Polyana was the substitution for the absence of his parents. Yasnaya Polyana was Tolstoy's cradle and grave.
Yasnaya Polyana оставалась точкой притяжения.
Yasnaya Polyana remained a powerful attraction for him, a magnet that always drew him back, because his most important memories of early childhood were associated with this place.
I remember my father in his study, where we used to come to say goodnight to him, and sometimes merely to play. He used to sit there with a pipe in his mouth on a leather couch. Sometimes, to our immense delight, he would let us climb on the couch behind his back, while he would continue reading or talking to the steward.
Это действительно идеализация.
Maybe Tolstoy didn't have this childhood. This was how he would have liked to have seen it. This was how he imagined it. This was how he imagined a loving family life. And love came to be the reason for his entire existence, including the basis for his religious views.
When they were children at Yasnaya Polyana, the Tolstoy brothers called themselves the Ant Brotherhood. The essence of what Yasnaya meant to Tolstoy grew out of a magical story that his eldest brother had invented for them.
Leo Tolstoy was 5, Nikolai, he was 11, and Nikolai announced that he had known a secret how to make all people happy. That marvelous secret was written on the green stick, and that little green stick was buried in the forest at the edge of the ravine by the road. And the one who would find the green stick could make all people happy. It would be a kind of golden age. People would become ant brothers. People would live without wars, diseases, in peace and Christian love and friendship. But Nikolai died, and the secret how to make all people happy died with him. But for Tolstoy, that naive, childish legend in the years to come became a profound philosophical symbol.
The death of his father brought an end to Tolstoy's rural childhood, and it was decided that he and his siblings would have to leave Yasnaya Polyana to live with an aunt in Kazan. Kazan, the ancient Tatar capital, is 500 miles east of Moscow. Since the 18th century, the city's maintained an impressive reputation as a place where Muslims and Christians have lived side by side in peace. Tolstoy's aunt, Polina, was married to the governor of Kazan, and the young Tolstoys moved into what was then the grand governorial residence. Well, I suppose it's hardly surprising that one revolution and 2 world wars later, it's not the centre of elegant society it used to be.
Hello? Hello?
The mansion is now being restored to celebrate Tolstoy's teenage years in the city. But not everything that happened to Tolstoy in Kazan merits celebration. Shortly after the Tolstoys arrived in the city, the older brothers decided that 14-year-old Lev was ready to be introduced to sex. So they took him to a brothel, which just happened to be located right next to the monastery where their grandfather was buried. It was simultaneously an act of sex and sacrilege that appears to have haunted him for the rest of his life. Many years later, Tolstoy would recall the incident, describing how after the act he wept bitterly by the side of the bed.
The point is now he's already into this cycle that he goes through interminably all the way through his life of living very badly indeed and then regretting it and castigating himself. And the turning point came when he was about 14 or 15 years old, because suddenly he read Rousseau. And when he read Rousseau, he found confirmation of how awful he was, but the great relief of knowing that all other boys did rather disgusting things to themselves. All other children were just as young savages. And that, first of all, must have given him a sense of relief. Thank goodness it's not just me.
2 years after arriving in the city, Tolstoy applied to study here at the prestigious Kazan University.
As soon as I entered the university auditorium, I felt my personality disappearing in this throng of self-confident young people who surged noisily through all the doors and corridors. When the professor came in, and everybody shifted about and then settled in their seats, I was amazed when he began his lecture with an introductory sentence which, in my opinion, did not make sense. I wanted the lecture to be so clever from beginning to end that it would be impossible to omit or add a single word. Disappointed in this, I immediately proceeded to sketch 18 caricatures joined together in a circle like a wreath, and only occasionally moved my hand across the page to make the professor think I was taking notes.
Things appear to have gone from bad to worse, so much so that the university authorities finally resorted to imprisonment. When Lev Nikolaevich failed to attend lectures, he was locked up overnight here in Kazan University's very own detention cell, where offenders were supposed to reflect on their misdemeanors with a night in the pitch dark. You can see the beginning of Tolstoy's lifelong contempt for authority. According to a fellow prisoner, he produced a candle from his boot and spent the night doing impersonations of the university professors.
Of course, he was a bad student, totally unsuited to structured education. And he walked out without a degree, of course, having failed in 2 faculties, never regretted it. In fact, he said triumphantly on a number of occasions, "I'm so glad I never went anywhere near an orthodox institute of education again in the rest of my life, and I benefited from it." And I think he probably did benefit from it. He had this raging, uncontrollable spirit leaping off in all directions.
But it wasn't that Tolstoy lacked intellectual ambition. He had a plan of his own, a rigorous one, which he confided to his diary.
1. To study the whole course of law necessary for my final examination at the university. 2. To study practical medicine and some theoretical medicine. 3. To study languages, French, Russian, German, 4. English. To study agriculture, both theoretical. 5. To study history, geography, 6. And statistics. To study mathematics, the grammar school course. 7. To write a dissertation. 8. To attain an average degree of perfection in music. And 9. To write down rules. 10. To acquire some knowledge of the natural sciences. 11.
In fact, Tolstoy was forever making lists and plans and promises to himself to be the strongest, the cleverest, the most saintly model of manhood. However, in diary entries that often remind you more of Adrian Mole than a future literary giant, he quickly discovers that writing the lists is the easy part.
18th of April 1847. I wrote down a lot of rules all of a sudden and wanted to follow them all, but I wasn't strong enough to do so. So now I want to set myself one rule only, and to add another one to it only when I've got used to following that one. The first rule, which I prescribe, is as follows. Number 1. Carry out everything you have resolved must be carried out. I haven't carried out this rule.
So why did Tolstoy have such trouble sticking to his own rules? Looking through his extraordinary early diaries, a recurring feature is his sexual appetite and the guilt that went with it. In fact, the very first entry in his diary comes as a direct result of his indulgences.
17th of March 1847. It is now 6 days since I entered the clinic, and for 6 days now I've been almost satisfied with myself. I caught gonorrhea, where one usually catches it from, of course, and this trivial circumstance gave me a jolt.
18th of April. I couldn't refrain. I beckoned to something in pink, which in the distance seemed to me very nice, and opened the door at the back. She came in. I couldn't see her. It was vile and repulsive. I even hate her because I've broken my rules on her account. Terrible remorse.
That was censored in the Soviet editions of Tolstoy's diaries, of course. And I can remember my Russian teacher, who came from Siberia, being totally incredulous when I told her that was what Tolstoy's diaries were about. He was self-obsessed, and I think the diaries and the letters are, in a way of making up a story about himself.
I must say, I was shocked when I read the diaries. I was enthralled that anyone could write so honestly at that time. It is honest.
It is. I think it is honest, and I think that in a way he loves castigating himself. I think all that stuff about sex, which might strike some readers as very shocking and others as a bit peculiar, that was him.
И основная мысль, которая проходит через все его.
The main thought that can be traced through all of his diaries, which he started at an early age and continued up to his death, is the thought of the meaning of good and the meaning of evil.
И что такое я? Добро или зло?
What am I? Good or evil? And what is good? What is evil? To resolve this, the most important task, Tolstoy embarks on a life of artistic creativity.
So when did Tolstoy actually begin to write? In April 1847, Tolstoy's student days came to an abrupt end when he inherited his portion of the family estate, including his beloved Yasnaya Polyana, and he immediately headed home. Over the next few years, the diaries give us a glimpse of a depressive and unfocused youth who was beginning to think about writing in some shape or form. However, this typical diary entry sums up his greatest problem.
April 17th, 1851. Wrote nothing. Laziness got the better of me.
1 month later, however, everything had changed.
I'm writing at 10 o'clock at night on June 30th. How did I get here? I don't know. Why? I don't know either. I'd like to write a lot about the journey from Astrakhan to the village, the Cossacks, the cowardice of the Tartars, and the steppe.
All of a sudden, Tolstoy had decided to join his brother Nikolai, who was serving in the army here in Chechnya. Russia was engaged in a war with this small, mountainous Muslim nation on its southern border. It was in many ways the same futile conflict that drags on in the region today. Nikolai was based in a village on the banks of the great Terek River, which at the time provided a border between Russian and Chechen territory. In this remote outpost of the empire, Tolstoy spent nearly 2.5 years of his life as a volunteer cadet soldier. He spent his time chasing the Cossack girls, playing cards, hunting for pheasants and hares, and taking part in the occasional raid into enemy territory, an experience which he clearly enjoyed and which earned him commendations for bravery. However, the most important feature of life in Chechnya was boredom. There was very little to do, and it was this combination of isolation and tedium that gave Tolstoy the inspiration to write. He began to work on an idea for a novel about the subject that he knew best, himself. Childhood, his first book, was an immediate hit with the Russian reading public. Although it's a novel, it draws on those early days at Yasnaya Polyana, a childhood most notable for the absence of a mother.
Mama is talking to someone, and the sound of her voice is so sweet, so warm. Just the sound of it goes to my heart. I gaze at her face, and all at once she becomes quite little, her face no bigger than a button. So you love me very much? She's silent for a moment, and then says, mind you always love me, and never forget me.
This silhouette is probably the only image Tolstoy ever knew of his mother.
It's partly memory, of course it is, but much of it is the childhood he didn't have, that he wished he'd had. I've sometimes thought that maybe the origins of his creativity, in a way, was trying to recapture that lost figure of the mother.
But it is all about him, isn't it?
He was the ultimate narcissist, wasn't he? He found himself infinitely fascinating, so all of his literary oeuvre really is the story of himself. His diary is an attempt to try and record his entire life, you know, his consciousness as it unfolded. No one had ever penetrated psychological processes as they evolved. No one had ever written from a child's point of view, as Tolstoy had. It was a totally new voice.
In his first novel, Childhood, Tolstoy found a reason for writing that lasted a lifetime. His unwaveringly honest fascination with himself, his own experiences, his own soul, would go on to provide a continuous thread through the whole shelf of his fiction. After 2 years in Chechnya, Tolstoy received his commission as an artillery officer and was posted west to the Black Sea region, where his regiment was embroiled in the build-up to the Crimean War. I headed down to the Crimea, in what is now the Ukraine, following in his tracks. At one point, he was based at an army encampment on the Belbek River, which runs a few miles outside the city of Sebastopol. We went looking for the likely spot where Tolstoy was billeted and where he succumbed to a disastrous addiction to gambling. Strangely, this little valley is once again being used as a temporary home for a troop of men, although now the bored and frustrated Ukrainians we met here aren't soldiers but railway workers, understandably bemused by our appearance at their station.
Astonishingly, this is the place where the momentous event took place, where he lost a great part of his fortune and the Yasnaya Polyana house. He writes on the 28th of January, just a few days after he's arrived, "Played Stoss for 2 days and nights. The result is understandable. The loss of everything. The Yasnaya Polyana house. I think there's no point in writing. I'm so disgusted with myself that I'd like to forget about my existence." 6th, 7th and 8th of February. Played cards again and lost another 200 rubles. I can't promise to stop. 12th of February. I mean, this just goes on and on over this whole period. 12th of February. Lost 75 rubles again. God is still merciful to me. I'm squandering my life, not living. My losses, however, are forcing me to come to my senses a bit.
As a result of these losses, the main house at Yasnaya Polyana was sold and dismantled. A stone still marks the spot where it once stood, a poignant reminder of the young Tolstoy's obsessive and reckless personality.
That gambling debt, where he lost tens of thousands, it's interesting that it happens at the very moment where he's about to go in and risk his life. So there must have been a great deal of stress going on in his life at that moment.
I think so, and also an urgent inward impulse to live life right to the extreme. It's what Russian culture is all about. It doesn't have the kind of compromises that we have. Compromise is a very positive concept in English culture. It's not in Russia. Russia was born to extremities, and that's why you've got Moscow versus St. Petersburg. And look at the novels, War and Peace, Crime and Punishment, and so on. And it's generally characterized by going out beyond normality to extremes of experience and then the registering of it in good literature.
Towards the end of 1854, Tolstoy crossed by boat into Sebastopol. Earlier that year, the Tsar had decided to occupy territory previously controlled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire, with the aim of getting a Russian foothold on the Mediterranean. Here in the Black Sea, the Russian Navy destroyed a Turkish fleet. Alarmed, the British and the French joined forces to protect their interests in the region. This elegant city became the main focus of the Crimean War. The siege of Sebastopol and the horror of his time here on the front line was a defining experience for Tolstoy, the soldier and the writer. Here, from the heart of the conflict, he wrote 3 revelatory stories describing the reality of war. The first of these stories, or sketches, takes the reader on a journey through the city. The narrator begins by describing the strange normality that continues in the streets and shops and restaurants.
Yes, disenchantment certainly awaits you on entering Sebastopol for the first time. You will look in vain in any of these faces for signs of disquiet, perplexity, or even of enthusiasm, determination, or readiness for death. There is nothing of the kind. What you see are ordinary people quietly occupied with ordinary activities.
But as the narrator walks up the hill through the town, the environment begins to change.
The whiz of cannonball or bomb nearby impresses you unpleasantly as you ascend the hill. And the meaning of the sounds is very different from what it seemed to be when they reached you in the town. You involuntarily expand your chest, raise your head higher, and clamber up the slippery clay hill. You've climbed only a little way before bullets begin to whiz past you to the right and left. And you will perhaps consider whether you had not better walk inside the trench that runs parallel to the road. You think you hear the thud of a cannonball not far off, and you seem to hear the sounds of bullets all around, some humming like bees, some whistling, and some rapidly flying past with a shrill shriek, like the string of some instrument. So this is the fourth bastion. This is that terrible, truly dreadful spot. But you are mistaken. This is not the fourth bastion yet. When you have gone some 300 steps more, you will come out at another battery. A flat space with many holes, surrounded with sandbags and cannons on platforms, and the whole place walled in with earthworks.
The fourth bastion was a kind of hell, the focus of the most intense bombardment and fighting. Thousands died here throughout the siege, and this is where Tolstoy's Sevastopol story reaches its dramatic climax.
Suddenly, the most fearful roar strikes not only your ears, but your whole being, and makes you shudder all over. It's followed by the whistle of the departing ball, and a thick cloud of powder smoke envelops you, the platform, and the black moving figures of the sailors. You will hear various comments made by the sailors concerning this shot of ours, and you will notice their animation. The evidences of a feeling that you had not perhaps expected. The feeling of animosity and thirst for vengeance, which lies hidden in each man's soul.
When someone is blasted from the earth with a big bomb in the fourth bastion, in the earthworks there, this has happened to Tolstoy as well. He served right at the front, right in the thick of things. He was recommended for bravery on several occasions. You've got the whiff of cordite and the smell of blood and everything in those war scenes in the novel. They're very gripping indeed.
You do have the feeling very much in those stories of the eyewitness, that this is happening, unfolding before this author. He published his first sketch, which is, I believe, the most anthologized piece of writing that he ever wrote. It was a sensation amongst the wider public. I've traced the uses of these sketches through the 19th century and even into the early 20th century, and you see them being sort of incorporated into histories of the period. They are treated like memoirs.
Despite the shockingly frank description of the war zone, the first sketch was a deeply patriotic work, a celebration of the bravery of the Russian soldier that was immediately popular in St. Petersburg.
The Tsar loved it so much that he had it sent to Brussels right away and translated into French for a foreign audience.
Shortly after, he began the second of his Sevastopol sketches. This time, the pride and patriotism have evaporated. The loss of life is depicted as terribly and utterly pointless. The Russian censor deleted large sections of the work.
There. I have said what I wish to say this time. But I am seized by an oppressive doubt. Perhaps I ought to have left it unsaid. Where in this tale is the evil that should be avoided, and where the good that should be imitated? Who is the villain and who is the hero of the story? All are good, and all are bad. The hero of my tale, whom I love with all the power of my soul, whom I have tried to portray in all his beauty, who has been, is, and will be beautiful, is truth.
He becomes far more realistic, as he would see it, far more honest about things, and declares the whole thing to be a waste of energy and just brutality. This is made clear in the second sketch. And it's emphasised by the ending of the sketch, where he says the hero of this story wasn't a soldier, it wasn't me, it wasn't anybody. The hero of this story is truth. And that truth, that warfare is always demeaning, violent, unnecessary, useless and disgusting, that will stay with him for the rest of his life and underlie all the pacifist teachings of his later works.
I think that Tolstoy was the first really grown-up author of world literature, because all the writers which wrote before him, they could be interesting, provoking, charming, but still they seem adolescent to me. Tolstoy, when he started writing as a young man, he started writing from the very beginning as an adult, as a grown-up person, describing life as it is, without any flair, without concealing nothing. His first novellas about the war in the Caucasus, about Sevastopol, they are very much unlike Dickens or Pushkin or Lermontov. They are about real life. They are really frightening. They are not pretty at all. And he went on like this, becoming stronger and stronger and stronger before he started thinking of himself as a new prophet.
From the blasted ruins of Sevastopol in the south, Tolstoy came straight here to fashionable, intellectual, imperial St. Petersburg. On his way to the capital, he clearly felt a great relief to be leaving the war behind him, but also a new sense of purpose, buoyed up by the success of the first sketch. He wrote in his diary,
"My career is literature, to write and write. From tomorrow, I'll work all my life or give up everything."
Literary Russia in the 19th century produced an extraordinary and wildly contrasting crop of writers, including Pushkin and Lermontov, Gogol, Dostoevsky and Chekhov, as well as Turgenev and Tolstoy. None of them were what we would call explicitly political writers, but the very act of writing about Russia brought them into conflict with the Tsarist state. Pushkin and Lermontov were sent into exile. Dostoevsky was put in front of a mock firing squad and sent to Siberia. And they all suffered extensive censorship when anything they wrote was deemed to question the status quo. Tolstoy's own outspoken account of the Crimean War attracted not only the attention of the censor, but also St. Petersburg's radical literary set.
When Tolstoy arrived here in St. Petersburg, the first person he went to visit was the writer Ivan Turgenev. Turgenev, then in his 30s, was a brilliant and influential novelist who'd been Tolstoy's literary hero ever since he was a student in Kazan.
And for nearly a month, Tolstoy camped on Turgenev's sofa. However, Tolstoy wasn't an easy house guest. He spent the nights out whoring and gambling, and the days sleeping. Turgenev wrote to a friend, "You cannot picture to yourself what a dear and remarkable man he is, although I have nicknamed him the troglodyte because of his uncouth passions and buffalo-like obstinacy."
It was a notoriously bitchy relationship, and there are countless entries in Tolstoy's diaries fulminating about Turgenev.
He's an uncongenial, cold and difficult person, and I'm sorry for him. I'll never get on with him.
But on the very first day that Turgenev met Tolstoy, he brought him here to the apartment of Nikolai Nekrasov for lunch. Nekrasov was an influential liberal figure and kingpin of the literary scene in St. Petersburg, and these handsome rooms were the forum for the city's radical conversation and debate. It was Nekrasov who'd first recognized Tolstoy's talent when he published the unsolicited manuscript of Childhood. Now he was printing Tolstoy's critiques of the Crimean War, the increasingly contentious Sebastopol sketches, in his magazine, The Contemporary.
I think it was 20,000 copies, which were read all around the country by nobility, by estate owners, by students, by high school students, by everybody who want to read Russian. And it was a line to buy it. and each new issue in a small provincial city was an event. Have you read this magazine? Give it to me, and so on. There was a whole circulation of this.
Turgenev was a leading light in this radical literary world of the contemporary, and there's no doubt that for a new writer in St. Petersburg, this was the place to be. That afternoon, they talked, they ate together, they played chess, and by the end of the day, Nekrasov, clearly captivated, concluded that Tolstoy was even better than his writing. But Tolstoy was far too independent and obstinate to fit in. Even though he himself arranged this group photograph, you can see how uncomfortable he looks. And it wasn't just Tolstoy's manner that set him apart from other members of the literary world. Tolstoy was a landowning count, and the hot topic of the day was land reform and the abolition of feudal slavery. For many of his writer friends, emancipation of the serfs was a political concept. But for Tolstoy, as a landowner, this was personal. He was the master of a great estate and the owner of over 300 peasants. It was an issue of conscience that preoccupied him for the rest of his life. There'd been Tolstoys at the imperial court for generations, and the young Count Tolstoy had privileged access to the Mariinsky Palace via this extraordinary 6-story ramp, which led straight to the private apartments of a royal lady-in-waiting, his young aunt, Alexandrine.
This is where they were first seen by everyone, because music played from the gallery. Musicians were located there. Music played when they arrived. And when dances started at the palace, they started over here and then proceeded to the so-called White Hall, which was used as a ballroom.
So when he came here in 1856, he'd been in Sebastopol, he'd been fighting the war.
Right.
How did he fit in then? He mixed with the literary set, of course, but he still visited his aunt.
Right, but the literary set whom he communicated, that was Nekrasov and other people, they were not persons of very special rank.
Turgenev, though, says, why don't you go off and join your princesses and disappear off with your posh friends, you know? So there was a sense, wasn't there, that Tolstoy belonged to this privileged class, even more privileged.
By all means, and he enjoyed it, by the way, particularly in the beginning, before he started to live a simple way of life like that. So he enjoyed being an aristocrat and be treated as an aristocrat indeed.
So Tolstoy would have come here to see his aunt, Alexandra, then?
Exactly, exactly.
What was the relationship like with her?
He liked this lady immensely. He used to call her joy and consolation. She understood. She was very witty, very intelligent. She possessed very strong will and quite an encyclopedic knowledge, particularly with the time she served at court. She learned more and more, and he even fell in love with her. So someone said that there was a rumor in St. Petersburg that she would marry Leo Tolstoy. And with her typical humor, she replied, when it happens, let me know about it.
It seems he did think of marrying Alexandrine, but instead their relationship turned into a friendship that lasted throughout most of his life. Tolstoy, in his early 30s, struggled with his writing, and his diaries reveal a restlessness and a morose lack of resolve barely changed from his student days in Kazan.
October 1860. Irresolution, idleness, melancholy, thoughts of death. I must escape from this.
And then, quite suddenly, 2 years later, he did.
September 1862. Letter to Alexandrine. I'm writing from the country. As I write, I can hear upstairs the voice of my wife, whom I love more than anything in the world. I've lived to the age of 34, and I didn't know it was possible to be so much in love and so happy.
Tolstoy's new bride was an 18-year-old girl from Moscow called Sofia Andreevna Berz, one of the daughters of an old friend.
She doesn't remember precisely when she met Tolstoy, but she remembers that when Tolstoy was leaving for war, the Crimean War, he stopped at their house to say goodbye, and she was 11, and it was the moment when she thought that she would become a nurse and join him at the front. But of course that did not happen, the war was brief. And that same year when she was 11, she read the Sebastopol Tales. And she read Tolstoy's novel Childhood, and she cried over it.
Despite their long acquaintance, the betrothal and marriage were rushed, awkward and brutal. Perhaps the strangest event of the engagement was when Tolstoy insisted that Sofia read his diaries, full of the details of his whoring, venereal diseases, and his recent affair with a peasant girl. It's a painfully telling moment in Tolstoy's story. We've seen him as an orphaned child, a difficult teenager, a dissolute young man. But here, at the moment of his wedding, he comes across as something altogether darker.
What did she make of what she saw in his diaries?
It was before the wedding that he gave her the diaries.
Right.
And she was appalled by his past. She imagined the man she would marry as a completely new, pure person. She was barely 18. She just turned 18. And Tolstoy, who was so sensitive in his novels, lacked the sensitivity in actual life.
In Sofia's autobiography, written many years later, she reveals just how traumatic the wedding, and in particular the wedding night, had been.
After Biryolevo, and even back at the station, the torment began, which every bride must go through. Not to mention the agony. What an embarrassment it was. How painful, how dreadfully humiliating.
Sophie describes their first night as a rape, and they made a stop in Biryolevo to change stations. That was not far from Moscow. And Tolstoy told her to serve tea, and she was so tense.
Tolstoy's diary entry is brutally unaffected.
She was in tears, in the carriage. She knows everything, and it's simple. Her timidity. Something morbid.
You can't help feeling sorry for Sofia, the new Countess Tolstoy. After the ordeal of the marriage and the nightmare journey, she arrives here at Yasnaya Polyana, her new home, the place where she would live for the rest of her life. What she finds is a remote, dilapidated house surrounded by overgrown and untended grounds, and a husband who, though passionate about his new wife, was moody, remote, and often absent for days at a time on hunting expeditions.
Here is an area where Tolstoy has been given the benefit of doubt when there isn't any doubt. He was nothing less than brutal towards her. I don't mean physically. I don't think he ever beat her up or knocked her around. But he treated her very badly indeed.
Yet despite the fact that Tolstoy was clearly an impossibly difficult husband, it was also an incredibly passionate marriage.
I cannot love him any more than I already do. I already love him to such excess, with all my heart and soul, that there's nothing in my mind but my love for him. Nothing.
The Tolstoys were man and wife for 46 years. Yes, it was a complex and often tortured relationship, but it was also an intensely productive and creative union. Sofia became both his copyist and his unofficial editor, and without her, it's hard to believe he could have achieved what he did. Exactly 9 months after the wedding, Sophia gave birth to her first child, Sergei, the first of 13 babies which she brought into the world over 25 years. 8 of these children survived childhood and went on to procreate today's grand dynasty, an impressive testament to the happier years of Lev and Sophia's marathon marriage.
There certainly was a time when I think he must have been not just happy, but blissfully happy. And there's no doubt in my mind that he knew he was going to write a major work of history and about humanity. And it just came out of his history as a writer. He fully matured, and it just happened at the time as well when his life came right. He'd written 20 or 30 short stories of one kind or another of varying quality, but many of them showing a lot of great promise indeed. And he said, I just feel that there is something working its way up within me which can only be described as epic. He actually used the word. War and Peace, this wonderful epic, surely the gold standard by which novels are all judged now, probably the greatest novel that's ever been written. A massive epic dealing with tidal waves of humanity moving across Europe, and yet an intimate epic, because you zoom down from those heights and you look at the intimate dealings of individuals all the way through.
Natasha sampled everything. Never in her life, she thought, had she seen or tasted buttermilk cakes like these, such delicious preserves, such nuts in honey, or a chicken like this one. Rostov and Uncle, as they downed their cherry-flavoured vodka after supper, talked of hunts past and future. Natasha felt so happy at heart, so much at home in these new surroundings that her only fear was that the trap would come for her too soon. When the conversation broke down for a moment, as it almost always does when you have friends in for the first time, Uncle responded to what was in his guests' minds by saying, "There you have it. Me in my last days. Soon be dead. Fair for the chase. Nothing left after that. So what's wrong with a bit of living in sin?"
My mother was a teacher of Russian literature, and I think that she was a very cunning person. When I was, I think, 10 or 11 years old, she told me, "Look, this is, on this upper shelf, is the novel War and Peace. You are never, ever to touch it before you are 15. You will understand nothing. It is meant for grown-ups." And of course, the first thing I did after she left, I started reading this thick novel. I skipped, of course, all the love scenes. I read only about war, but by the age of 11, I was a fan of Tolstoy. Because for us, for me, Andrei Bolkonsky or Natasha Rostova or Pierre Bezukhov, they are alive, not like real people who used to live in the 19th century. In fact, they are more alive to me than a lot of people that live today and whom I know personally.
If the so-called peace, the domestic scenes in War and Peace, grew from Tolstoy's own family life, equally, the war or public scenes were based on some of the most important events in recent Russian history. In 1812, Napoleon's army invaded Russia. The following conflict saw horrendous casualties, the destruction of Moscow, followed by the decimation of the French as they retreated in the middle of winter. This triumphal arch, built on the great highway heading west out of Moscow, commemorates the Russian victory. The turning point in the war, the Battle of Borodino, continues to have great historical, political, and emotional significance for the Russians, and is reenacted every year on the battlefield about 60 miles west of Moscow. And it's this vast, iconic clash, a battle that took the lives of at least 70,000 men, which Tolstoy brought to life as the climax of War and Peace.
For people like me involved in the reconstruction, War and Peace is the Bible. The thing is, Lev Tolstoy himself was a serving officer. His baptism of fire was in the Crimea, and no one can describe things like he does. He's not simply the greatest writer, he is a military man.
Tolstoy's epic account of Borodino takes up about 250 pages of War and Peace. It was written only 50 years after the event, when the last veterans were only just dying out, and Tolstoy made sure he read and researched voraciously around the subject. To help bring the whole thing alive in his mind, in the autumn of 1867, he made a special trip here to the battlefield. He took with him his wife Sophia's younger brother, Stepan, who was only 12 years old. You can imagine the boy must have been in heaven, pacing out the troop manoeuvres and identifying all the landmarks of the battle with his knowledgeable and enthusiastic guide. Where was Napoleon? Where did Kutuzov, the great Russian field marshal, make his camp? How were the two giant armies arrayed across this gentle rural landscape before the slaughter began?
When Tolstoy and Stepan arrived at Borodino, they stayed in a monastery on the edge of the battle site. Today, that monastery has been turned into a museum dedicated to Tolstoy's visit and the extraordinarily vivid account of the battle which it inspired.
This document looks like it was written right here at Borodino. You can see the top part of the page is in a child's round hand. It seems as if Tolstoy was dictating his thoughts and ideas to Stepan, who wrote them down whilst they were inspecting the Borodino battlefield. He even drew a little plan of how the sun rises and sets over Borodino field. Tolstoy was very pleased with his research trip and wrote to his wife, Sophia Andreevna, "If God will give me health and peace of mind, I will write the Battle of Borodino in a way that's never been done before."
Rostov, without waiting to hear them out, touched his horse, galloped to the front of his squadron, and before he had time to finish giving the word of command, the whole squadron, sharing his feeling, was following him. Rostov himself did not know how or why he did it. He acted as he did when hunting, without reflecting or considering. He saw the dragoons near and that they were galloping in disorder. He knew they could not withstand an attack, knew there was only that moment, and that if he let it slip, it would not return.
One of the main characters of War and Peace is an enthusiastic young cavalry officer called Nikolai Rostov. For Rostov, the excitement and bravado of the battlefield soon evaporates when confronted by his enemy.
The French dragoon officer was hopping with one foot on the ground, the other being caught in the stirrup. His eyes, screwed up with fear as if he every moment expected another blow, gazed up at Rostov with shrinking terror. His pale and mud-stained face, fair and young, with a dimple in the chin and light blue eyes, was not an enemy's face at all suited to a battlefield, but a most ordinary, home-like face. Before Rostov had decided what to do with him, the officer cried, "I surrender!" Rostov galloped back with the rest, aware of an unpleasant feeling of depression in his heart. Something vague and confused, which he could not at all account for, had come over him with the capture of that officer and the blow he had dealt him.
I think a very interesting figure in War and Peace is young Nikolai Rostov, who incredibly well described as a young cavalry officer. And I don't know if you remember the scene where he raises his sabre in a battle. And in the very moment of raising his sabre against this poor French officer, he sees the man's fear in his face.
Yes.
And he thinks, what the hell am I doing? And he brings the sword down and he just snicks the man. And thereafter, they're all saying, well done, Rostov, and the colonel says, "Oh, you've got a decoration from the emperor for this, my boy." And he feels utter wretchedness and misery inside, and the story has begun of his realizing that it's mad fighting battles and attacking people with swords and guns, and war is just fundamentally wrong. It's a brilliant scene in which you see the whole seeds of pacifism growing in the novelist's mind.
In War and Peace, we see Tolstoy bring to life a staggering 500 characters, building a world, a narrative, and an emotional landscape that remains unequaled. The book is a profoundly patriotic narrative. It charts the defeat and expulsion of an invading foreign army, and as such, it was a book that was handed out by Stalin's commissars during the Second World War to motivate the Red Army in their monumental struggle against the Nazis. However, the abiding moral message of this book is not patriotism, but pacifism. The angry protest of the Sebastopol sketches has matured into an anatomical examination of the evils of war.
One or two dark clouds had come up, and a fine drizzle was sprinkling the dead, the wounded, the fearful, the weary, and the wavering. Good people, that's enough, it seemed to say. Stop and think. What are you doing?
This voice of moral authority that Tolstoy discovered in War and Peace would go on in the second half of his life to become ever louder, more urgent, and central to his writing. It was 1869 when Tolstoy finished War and Peace, and he had every reason to feel confident and relaxed. The book was hugely successful, and the money was rolling in. But while travelling out in the country, he ended up staying in a hotel in the small, remote town of Arzamas.
It's quite difficult to understand the thing. He woke in the night and he had a terrible vision of death bearing down upon him. And that vision of death told him that because death exists, life itself was not worth living. It's a kind of existential madness that came upon him. Absolute abject terror. Everything. We all know that Tolstoy is a titanic figure, isn't he? A big man who could lift heavy weights and lived to be 82, fathered 13 children. Everything he did was gargantuan. And so was this, what the rest of us would call a midlife crisis, a sudden loss of confidence in everything in the world.
I was afraid to get up from the sofa, afraid of driving away sleep. And just to be sitting in that room seemed awful. I didn't get up, but fell into a sort of doze.
I thought of going out of the room to get away from what was tormenting me, but it followed me and made everything seem dark and dreary. My feeling of horror, instead of leaving me, was increasing. What nonsense, I said to myself. Why am I so dejected? What am I afraid of? You are afraid of me. I heard the voice of death. I am here. I shuddered. Yes, death. Death will come. It will come.
The nightmare encounter with his own mortality and the inevitability of death in the hotel room at Arzamas would mark a turning point in Tolstoy's life and the beginning of a transformation that would lead him to reject and dispense with everything he'd achieved, everything he owned, and everything he loved.
In part 2, we follow Tolstoy as he transforms himself from troubled novelist into Russia's leading troublemaker. We travel through the emptiness of a Russian steppe.
Look, I've really drunk it.
through the dark pages of his masterpiece, Anna Karenina, and on into religious and political turmoil as he's excommunicated from the church and branded an enemy of the state. All that and brutal heartbreak.
I was never even in love.
I truly believe that death, with our love intact, would be preferable to this misery.
That's next Sunday at 10:25. Sporting triumph against the odds. Johnny Lee Miller stars in our film as Flying Scotsman next tonight.